Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. Just a quick introduction. So I'm Ruben. I am with WWF International as the global lead for Carbon Finance and Markets. But based in the region out of Singapore, I'm very happy to be here. It's been a whirlwind 2.5 days of meetings, but many ideas and potential to explore further. But I thought for today, it's useful for me to talk about three things, and I broke it down into three different pieces. So the first is explaining what the network policy is, right? Because I think that forms the basis of any carbon work that's done throughout the network. So it's important that everyone is aware of it, and we can also discuss through some questions you have about it. And then second is how the WWF network currently does carbon projects. So although the position is new, we released it at COP29. Carbon is not new for WWF, right? There have been different offices that have been doing projects, but at the same time, there's been a Panda DNA to all the projects, right? There's a reason why the project was done, and I'll go through what are the commonalities between these projects, because it's useful to keep that in mind as the WWF-Cambodia embarks on this carbon journey. And last, just a quick one slide on what are the opportunities and challenges that we've identified in the last two days in Cambodia that can give you a flavor of what might come up in the future and what work could come your WWF Cambodia's way. So I thought it's useful to start with the reason why WWF is involved in carbon. So how the current market norm is, and you might be aware of it by hearing it outside, is that carbon finance is seen to be together with carbon markets and carbon credits. Right? So it's seen to be, buying credits to offset your emissions. Right? And WWF has a problem with it, principally because it does not lead to a change in business practices. Right? The classic case is an oil and gas company planting trees in Africa, but they're still going to go on with their oil and gas. They're not going to reduce production. They're not going to remove the carbon. They're not going to store it in the ground. They're going to carry on practices, but they claim to be net zero because they're planting in trees and nothing is going to change. And that's why the fundamental belief of WWF is supporting market transformation. How can carbon finance be used to transform that particular sector or that company to more low carbon solutions, right? And that's because the fundamental belief in decarbonization is to follow the mitigation hierarchy, right? Which is first you avoid, right, where you can, and to reduce as much as you can, and where you can't reduce, and the residual emissions, and that's where carbon credits can play a role, where one, there is no solution to reduce, or two, it is impossible economically or for some other reasons to do so. So it's really a last mile resort for carbon crediting and carbon finance, and that's where WWF firmly believes that it should be employed and not as the first solution. Right? The third is fundamentally what we see a lot in the market is a lot of carbon investment going into the cheapest type of project. Right? So we see, and nothing against RED Plus, it has its benefits and it has worked in some scenarios, but they are among the cheaper projects to implement. So cook stove is another example that we see very clearly. But some criticism is that does that really lead to changes in business behavior, or does that lead to the deforestation moving to another site just because there's a RED Plus site going on, but as a whole we're not stopping deforestation happening in the country, right? So, and that's why the firm belief of WWF is to move from a project level carbon intervention into a landscape level carbon intervention. So yesterday, to share, for example, when we had meetings with the ministry, we were speaking to them about moving away from project level RED into a more jurisdictional approach of RED, where you're not only looking at tracking deforestation within the protected areas, but in Cambodia as a whole, right? And then you can meaningfully drive change. So that's the fundamental philosophy in why WWF does carbon. It's to move away from an offsetting-based, a project-based approach to a market, industry, and jurisdictional-based approach. Right? So that's useful to set the context. So with that in mind, the position is broken up into three parts. So the first is, what do we ask of companies? And it's important when you engage, or any Panda engages corporates, of what the 3 key asks is of corporate. So the first is to focus on your value chain emissions. And what we mean by that is direct emissions that the company has, but also indirect emissions. And what we mean by indirect emissions is emissions of services upstream, meaning that what is being procured in terms of product services, but also downstream, how the products are being used and the emissions that results from that, right? The second ask is, beyond just looking at their emissions, companies should account for the full impact of their emissions. So, and what we mean by full impact is not having a singular focus on carbon, but to have to look at what is the social as well as economic impact of their emissions, and to quantify that into a price, a fee, and then to deploy that. I'll share that about later in a little bit more detail. And the third is, so I mean, just to share, because we're in a very candid thing, that I mean, and also since I joined the network, there has been, and engaging external partners, there's been various perceptions of WWF's view on carbon, to the extent that some groups outside feel that WWF is perceived to be anti-carbon, right, or anti-carbon markets and anti-credits. But that's not the philosophy. The philosophy is about being most effective in channeling finance, and take a holistic look in what market instrument can be deployed to make what limited finance is available work the most. So the philosophy that we have is, it's not about how much finance you generate, it's about how much impact you generate, right? So just because you're generating $2 million for investments, is it the most impact that you can have with that $2 million, and how that $2 million can be deployed to achieve that impact? So that's the fundamental philosophy that WWF has in engaging companies. So I'll share a bit more on what this means. So this translates into 4 steps that we ask companies to do. The first is, of course, reduce according to a credible pathway to 1.5 degrees, right? And alignment with SBTi is part of that process. But we do recognize that that would still leave companies with remaining emissions year on year, even though they've reduced what they can, and residual emissions that no matter how much they try, they can't reduce, for example, because technological solutions do not exist. Right? And then we encourage companies to quantify what they're remaining into a dollar value. So what that means is basically, we don't prescribe, but just to share an example of Singapore, right? So there is a national carbon price. Now it's $25 a ton. So a company assuming has 100 tons of emissions left, that would translate into 2,500 in yearly dollars allocated for climate investments. And that's a critical part of the difference, is to go beyond just reducing, but to also take into account for what you are emitting year on year anyway. So the second aspect is quantifying that price and setting a carbon fee. All right. Yeah. So the third part is, how do companies then invest that money that they've set aside? So in 3 main buckets, and I'll cover the from the right to the left. So the first is investments in high quality mitigation outcomes. This is outside the company's value chain, and that's where credits can come in a role, right? So because credits are essentially a neutral currency of which carbon is quantified and a price is put on that carbon, it can be one way it's financed, or it can be financed directly without a crediting mechanism as well. Second is to invest in ecosystem enablers, right? So for example, investing in research that can have a multiplier effect on further decarbonization, investments into community engagements, into buildings that and drive behavior change, and further reduce carbon. So that's another example. But third, to also go beyond the targets that they've set for that year or that 5-year mark, and to take in additional investments to further reduce emissions. And the last aspect is to report what companies are doing in a credible manner. Essentially, that means 2 things. For companies to report how much they're reducing, how much they're removing from the environment, for example, through reforestation, but also through tech-based removals. We spoke with a biochar company yesterday, that's not the example of it. But third is to report how much credits that they're using. And lastly, how companies claim is an important part of it. And recommendation is for companies not to claim that they're net zero, because then the tendency is for that to be a front and not for further questions to be asked on exactly how companies are doing it, right? So the focus not to be on that, but to be on what they're actually doing in terms of reductions, removals, as well as investments into carbon credits. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah. So this was an important part of the last 2 days as well. I think we engaged the 3 key ministries in Cambodia on this. So the ask of governments is to develop important and well-designed policy instruments that can drive decarbonization. So an example, yesterday we had a very important, good meeting with the Ministry of Economy and Finance in the afternoon, that they are developing guidelines and principles for carbon credit agreements. And helping the government build those guidelines and principles is important, because it sets the stage for how companies can implement the carbon credit projects. And having that upstream role is important, and very happy to hear that the government of Cambodia is coming up with this standardized policy and approach for carbon credit projects, right? And it's good that WWF continues to be part of that process. Second is working together to create financial instruments. A good example of it is what's happening in Brazil now, where the government has, for example, come up with what we call the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, the TFFF, where they have come up with a new model of financing, where financing is allocated not based on the number of tons reduced, but the amount of land that's being restored or protected, right? So it's moving away from a ton-based approach to a land-based approach, which has its pros and cons, right? But what it gives other governments or companies the potential to do is give them options based on what's most deployable in their particular landscape. And it gives an alternative to what comes now. So other governments, but also companies, are in a position to decide what's most effective. Again, going back to that, to the mantra of what is most effective employment of finance, and governments have a role in creating those and catalyzing those new models, right? And the last aspect is important for Cambodia, because I think another key reflection is that Article 6, internationally traded carbon credits between governments or airlines, is a key part of the Cambodian government strategy. And there's clear guidance that WWF supports on it. So just to highlight some key elements, we encourage full transparency and part of the process. How much is being sold, how much is being bought, what activities are being included under it. Are there sufficient FPIC, community engagement benefits that are flowing as part of it? Are there adaptation elements included? So full transparency in that process. But the other element that's equally important, and we emphasize this in the meetings as well, is to ensure that what's being agreed to is being done. Right? Especially when we talk about Article 6, there is a requirement to fulfill the rules. And it's important that that's being done to maintain the integrity of the system as a whole. And this is very relevant to WWF-Cambodia as well, because nature features as a key element in many of these projects, is on nature-based solutions. And next slide, please. There are 7 elements that the policy identifies, which wouldn't come as a surprise to most, given that many of these are part of what being a Panda is about. So a human rights-based approach. But second is to move away from short-term financing into long-term financing, right? So a good example is what's happening in WWF Vietnam, where there's a 20-year investment in a particular nature-based restoration project, right? And that's a good example because of the financial certainty. Then projects can be undertaken to look not just at carbon, but how nature as well as biodiversity is being protected or restored, right? And I've spoken about implementation at scale, and that's something we're looking at in the landscapes that WWF Cambodia is working in. How can we not just look at a site And I think it's good that, for example, Dennis is here and Alistair is here, but how we can also look beyond Cambodia and maybe look at transboundary sites, right? Because boundaries are man-made, and we know animals or biodiversity across these boundaries, and landscapes are across boundaries as well. And for example, the landscape that we're looking at here borders, or rather is connected with the WWF Vietnam landscape, right? So how can we take a holistic approach to it, and to implement projects at scale is something to consider. And on multiple benefits, and I'll cover that in the case studies that I'll highlight, but it's about delivering benefits beyond carbon itself. One of the fundamental issues with carbon projects is a singular focus on carbon, right? So how many tons is being reduced? How many tons is being removed? But case studies have shown us, and multiple successful projects have shown us, that if you want to deliver lasting benefits, it needs to deliver benefits to people, nature, as well as the climate. Only then can projects have longevity and high integrity, right? And maybe on the last point to highlight is having robust monitoring technologies. We just had an earlier meeting today on how we can leverage technology and technology solutions to do real-time monitoring, for example, of fire risks, of grievance mechanisms, and how can we leverage technology to help do that better, to help reduce costs, but also increase the efficiency to do that. Right. Okay, great. So going into how WWF currently engages on carbon. So 5 main commonalities. So the first is who buys the carbon credit is cardinal for WWF. It's super important. Right? Why? Is because we don't want the credits to be used for offsetting to meet the emissions reductions, right? And so what's important is that there are safeguards put into who buys those credits. One of that safeguard is no secondary trading. So to explain a bit more on how the carbon markets currently work, a significant proportion of market, not saying a significant proportion, but a proportion of the market is being traded on the secondary trade. And what we mean by that is that carbon brokers buy the credits and they hold on to the credits in speculation that the price of the credits will be higher in a few years and they can sell it for a profit. What that means is that there's lack of transparency how long you're going to hold and who's eventually going to take that up. It might be another oil and gas company, it might be a company that doesn't align with WWF standards, for example. So for that reason, for WWF, where there's no transparency, it has to be retired immediately. Other NGOs, for example, also hold that. Like when we engage some of the other players in Cambodia, it's a requirement for them that happens as well. Second, the focus is very often, and you'll see that in the 5 project, it's not the carbon itself, but where the carbon project can lead to greater community empowerment and benefits, then that's being done. Third is there's a strong commonality of partnerships with government, strengthening government's implementation of carbon projects, but also helping them achieve their national targets through carbon. The fourth I've spoken about a lot, so I won't go through much, but no offsetting. And throughout the projects, there is almost, the first priority is integrity, and that the project is implemented with the highest possible standard of integrity. I think that's very much part of the Panda DNA, and it's what differentiates WWF from many of the other partners in this space, and it's important that we preserve that and continue to keep that as part of our project development as we move towards project development. Next. So just to highlight some examples, so in Mexico, for example, there is a Red Plus project, but I understand they're also looking at biodiversity credits for that. And really, the next slide, please. The characteristic of the project is that 100% because these are community-owned lands by the indigenous people, by the Ahidos, right? 100% of the profits goes to them. And WWF comes in as a role to facilitate them to get these carbon revenues from their lands. But they have full say into how that revenues is being used and how the project is being developed. So WWF comes in, again, the community focus is the center here, right? How can the communities benefit from the lands that they own in a manner that protects nature? And to highlight a key component of this, why WWF is involved in this protecting those lands is because those lands are key areas for the monarch butterfly to migrate. So that's why the protection of that land is key, and we're helping communities to protect that land through carbon benefits. So yeah, just to highlight on what's being done. So it's not as large a project as what could be done on the Red Plus on the conservation sites that WWF is looking at, but it's not a small project either, right? So that gives you a good sense of what's currently being done and what's being looked at. So further expansion areas, again, with a strong community and biodiversity focus on it. Next slide. Yeah, and Nima, to answer your question. So it gets the funds for the project development, primarily to grants, and then it implements it, but it continues to stay engaged in the process. But the community has full say into how the price for those credits are being negotiated, for example, or the selling conditions. But of course, WWF comes in to recommend how it's being sold and recommend best practices for that. And it's really looking at the opportunities and challenges for Cambodia in carbon. So first is there's very clearly an opportunity to blend different streams of carbon finance in Cambodia. There is a long-standing history of using grant-based finance to catalyze low carbon but also environmentally friendly carbon projects. I think Ibis Rice is a good example of it, right? But there's an opportunity to explore how we can either scale Ibis Rice or continue the longevity of Ibis Rice projects if we twin it with carbon projects. So it's an example of how we can bring together different streams of finance and move away from a project base into a landscape based approach, and that's definitely something we must explore, and I'm happy to continue exploring that. The second is on activity type. There's a lot of potential. So throughout the meetings that we've had, some ideas that have come up. So first is on sustainable agriculture practices, how to move away from the use of inorganic fertilizers that is harming the environment into more sustainable agricultural practices, but also beyond that. So on rice, for example, can we do methane reduction? That's one possibility that came up. Second, which is a priority of the government, and this came up multiple times as well, and I know it's a priority as part of our forest strategy going forward, is look at restoration. There's a lot of potential in Cambodia given the historically high deforestation rates to do that, but of course the caveat is we should explore how we do restoration in a manner that doesn't lead to leakage, right? Just because you're restoring that, and that shouldn't drive the companies or the government to deforest at a greater rate in other areas, right? Second is how do we develop a pathway to jurisdictional risk? I know we manage 2 sites, and for example, if there's interest to explore project level rate, it's with the view to move towards jurisdictional rate, because that is the network approach, and it's only then that you can truly account for carbon in the country, right? But there's definitely, we need to start that process to account for carbon, put in the places in place so that what's being developed can nest into a jurisdictional approach. And the last aspect, and probably the most nascent, and probably the most exploratory, is on agroforestry. There are big rubber plantations, pepper plantations, and how do we, again, like rice, adopt more sustainable agriculture techniques to reduce the carbon footprint from that particular land use, right? So there's a lot of opportunity. It's hugely positive. So I'm coming out of meetings feeling very encouraged, but nonetheless there are potential pitfalls that we need to look out for in Cambodia. So one, moving away from this traditional project-based approach to carbon finance. I think WWF is in a good opportunity coming into this space at a more informed time to think about how we break away from this very project level and very project level rate approach to think about how we can think about a landscape approach when we talk about carbon. Right? I think that will really go some way in differentiating WWF from the other carbon projects that are being developed in the region, right? And really create a high integrity niche. I think you all know me better than me, but navigating government relations is going to be key. Different stakeholders are very interested because of the potential revenues that are coming out of carbon, and navigating that will be a key aspect as we go into that carbon. Right? Third is staying true to WWF's principles, right? And the position that I highlighted. How can, if we generate carbon credit, make sure that it's used in a manner that is aligned with WWF's approach? So for Article 6, for beyond value chain mitigation, I think that will be crucial in maintaining the integrity of WWF, not only in Cambodia, but as a network. Right? And that's where the 5 elements that I highlighted will give you some flavor of like, how can that be done in Cambodia that sticks to the commonalities that WWF has as its own carbon project. Yeah, so that's all I have. I hope it's been useful, informative, and hopefully this is just a start of an entire conversation and work stream on carbon. Yeah.